any significance to the numbers in the story and how people interpret it? Like there's 5 people in, 5 people out.
Yeah.
There's 10 total. Scholarship is saying anything about that?
So you would think so, because if you've read Augustine, you'll know every time there's a number, he's like, oh, it means this, and these are your 5 senses, and all that. I didn't actually come across that this week, although I didn't go into my church fathers library, which I do have. My guess is Augustine would say something like that. These are your 5 senses, and they're dulled when you're not into... You know what? It's not about that. These are not allegories. They're stories. And as much as I love some of what Augustine did, I think trying to read too deeply into the details of these stories actually masks the overall narrative of them. So I didn't do that research this week. That's my guess of what Augustine would say on that and some of the church fathers. I'm actually not a big allegorical reader, though. I like to think about what's the narrative here? What are these characters thinking? How do we place ourselves in there rather than trying to piece them out? You brought up allegory last week as well.
Yeah, I think when we're rigorously approaching the text, we can go down paths that aren't that helpful, looking for a sign under every rock. But I do think when we read these texts more devotionally, we sit with them quietly, we maybe do like a Lectio Divina, some sacred reading practice, I think everything is on the table. I think if it appears to you that 5 on one side and 5 on another has some significance in your prayer life, like you should run with that in your imagination. So I think there are times to maybe welcome the allegory, but I do think when we are really looking at what was intended, what was going on in the context, it falls apart.
I want to add to that because I think that's really important, Bobby. I think there's ways that we understand what's the story about, what's the research here, what's the history, how do we put it in context, and then there is that like, okay, where does the Spirit remind me of something? That may not be what the story means, so you can't impose that on somebody else. But I think it's a really beautiful thing when Spirit awakens you to something and say, oh, maybe this is my right hand and my left hand. How am I thinking about that? How does that move me forward in my own devotion? Absolutely, I'm with Bobby. You should embrace those types of things. What we don't want to do is then say, well, that's what it means, and therefore I'm going to impose it on anyone else.
Can you say more about a Jesus who talks more about judgment at the end? Like, why didn't he lead with this stuff? Does this mean that Jesus is becoming more self-aware? Or is judgment the pinnacle of his teaching?
So the really interesting thing about Jesus' development in the Gospels, particularly Matthew is the easiest one to see it, is that it's not all judgment at the end, it's parable at the end. So it's true, in Matthew 25, we get these 3 parables of judgment that are going to lead into Holy Week. And I think the connection there is the intensity of what's going to happen in his persecution and death. And so Jesus is talking both to his own personal narrative of what's coming, but also to the disciples. Like, there's judgment coming. It's coming for me. It's coming for you. It's coming for all of us, because judgment happens between us all the time. But the movement that happens in Jesus from early Matthew, Sermon on the Mount, pretty beautiful but wise, common sense sermon, to more parable story-driven, is not all just about judgment. In Matthew 13, he tells a series of parables about the kingdom. The kingdom is like. This one started with the kingdom of heaven is like. But they're more about picturing the imagination of God's imagination for the world. And so I don't want you to come away with the idea that the movement is toward judgment. I think the movement is toward story. The movement is toward encouraging you to work for it a little bit and dig a little bit and see what's there to uncover. And when you start to look at the parables, you're going to see there's a lot of different themes in them. Here we've broken them up as parables of grace, parables of judgment, parables of kingdom. We're doing this series because we've already done the other 2 sets of parables, so you can find them in our archives. But that's the real beautiful thing about Jesus, is story is going to capture us. Story is going to force us to work in new ways. And story is going to bring something out of us in that process. But it's about grace, it's about kingdom, it's about judgment. And, last thing, I think some of these judgment parables are not what we imagine them to be when we actually root down into them a little bit. I think they're more about invitation than we think they are.
Yeah, I think it is really interesting. Something I was holding all day thinking about your message, Jer, is how do I take the end of these parables as seriously as we take the beginning? When Jer pointed out so beautifully what we've already hit on is this, like, it's always invitation, always invitation, always invitation. When you just sit with the end of these things, man, they're pretty crushing. like it's like the five who were unprepared are walking away from the party, and the door is shut, and it's end scene. And I am pushing myself and pushing my imagination to wonder, how do I take what I see at the beginning of this thing and carry it through to the end? So what I wonder about, in my sacred imagination, as the scholar Will Gaffney would say, is that the last line of this story is like, what is it again? Dang it.
Therefore, be ready and watchful, something like that. I'm going to freshly phrase
the
here.
end is just like, they weren't ready, and they're, you see them walking away. And in my imagination, I was like, oh, then the door opens again. Mm-hmm. And the sense, like the Jesus I want to see at the end of the story is like, just kidding, like, come in. And like, I really enjoyed playing with it because I wanted to know, how do I carry the Jesus I encounter at the beginning of this story all the way through? And I am just saying this was my own imagination running with it today. And so we welcome that in story. We are invited to bring our imagination to these stories. So when you hit a bump at the end and you think, oh my gosh, this doesn't feel like anything like invitation, it feels like exclusion. I insisted tonight that I think about the Jesus I found at the beginning of the story all the way through to the end. And I saw a different scene. I just saw something humorous. I saw the Christ welcoming them much like the beginning started.
Well, you get three stories, right?
Yeah.
So the next one starts with invitation again.
What's going to happen?
Is it good for me to get sent away from a party once or twice so that I can come back to the third one? I mean, maybe it is. Who knows?